The dust hung thick in the Texas air as Ethan Nash stared down at the two fresh graves, his brothers and sister-in-laws. The reality of becoming guardian to their three young children settling on his shoulders like the weight of his family's failing cattle ranch. At 32, Ethan had never imagined himself as a father, let alone to his nieces and nephew. But typhoid fever hadn't asked permission before stealing away James and Mary, leaving behind 7-year-old Abigail, 5-year-old Thomas, and 3-year-old Rebecca. The year was 1878, and Willow Creek was just another struggling settlement in West Texas. Ethan had spent the past decade working the Nash family ranch alongside his brother, building what they hoped would be a legacy for their children. Now James was gone, and Ethan was left with 3 grieving children, a mortgage he could barely afford, and a growing sense that he was woefully unprepared for the responsibility thrust upon him. "Uncle Ethan," Abigail's small hand tugged at his dusty coat sleeve. "When are we going home, home?" The word hit him like a physical blow. Their home would never be the same, but he nodded anyway, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Right now, darlin'," he said, his voice rough from the unshed tears he wouldn't allow himself to release. "Let's get you all back to the ranch." The ride back was silent, except for Rebecca's occasional whimpers. Thomas stared vacantly at the horizon, his father's too large hat sitting awkwardly on his small head. James had placed it there just before the fever took him, a symbolic passing of responsibility that the boy couldn't possibly understand. The Nash Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of mostly hard scrabble land, with a modest 2-story farmhouse that had seen better days. As they approached, Ethan could see the peeling white paint, the loose shutter hanging by a single hinge, and the fence posts that needed replacing. Everything James had planned to fix next season. Now it was all Ethan's problem. "Are you hungry?" he asked as he helped the children down from the wagon. He realized he had no idea when they'd last eaten. Had someone brought food after the funeral? He couldn't remember. Abigail nodded, always the spokesperson for her siblings. "Yes, sir." Ethan led them into the kitchen, a room that had always been Mary's domain. He stared helplessly at the cold stove, the empty countertops. What did children eat? He knew how to make coffee and fry bacon, but beyond that, his culinary skills were non-existent. "I can make sandwiches," Abigail offered, reading his expression correctly. "No, I'll do it," Ethan said, feeling a stab of shame. "You just sit down with your brother and sister." He managed to cobble together some bread and cold ham, setting the plates before the children with a sense of inadequacy that threatened to overwhelm him. They ate silently, and he wondered if they were always this quiet or if grief had stolen their voices. The next morning brought no reprieve. Rebecca woke crying for her mother, and Thomas wet the bed. Abigail tried to help, but she was just a child herself. Ethan spent the day torn between ranch chores that couldn't wait and 3 children who needed more than he knew how to give. By the end of the week, the house was in disarray. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowed from baskets, and dust gathered on every surface. The children were wearing the same clothes for the 3rd day in a row because Ethan had no idea how to operate the washing tub properly. And his one attempt had ended with clothes that were still dirty and now smelled vaguely of lye soap. Sunday morning found him standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the empty pantry. They needed supplies, but the thought of taking all 3 children into town made his stomach knot with anxiety. He'd have to manage it somehow. "Get your shoes on," he told the children. "We're going to town." The trip was as difficult as he'd feared. Rebecca had a tantrum in the general store, Thomas wandered off twice, and Abigail, trying too hard to be helpful, knocked over a display of canned goods. By the time they returned home, Ethan's nerves were frayed beyond measure. As the weeks passed, a routine of sorts developed. Ethan would wake before dawn to handle the essential ranch work, rush back to get the children fed and dressed, then drag them along for the rest of his chores or leave Abigail in charge if he needed to ride out to check the herd. The house grew more chaotic, the meals more haphazard, and the children more withdrawn. One afternoon, as rain pelted the windows and turned the yard to mud, Ethan sat at the kitchen table attempting to mend Thomas's torn shirt. His fingers were too big for the needle, and he cursed under his breath as he pricked himself for the third time. "Uncle Ethan," Abigail stood in the doorway, her doll clutched to her chest. "Rebecca's crying again, and I can't make her stop." Ethan dropped the shirt and needle, following the sound of Rebecca's wails to the small bedroom the girls shared. The little girl was huddled on her bed, her face red and tear-streaked. "What's wrong, Becca?" he asked, sitting awkwardly on the edge of the bed. "I want Mama," she sobbed, the words tearing at his heart. "I know, darlin'," he said, reaching out a hesitant hand to stroke her hair. "I know you do." "When is she coming back?" Rebecca hiccuped, looking up at him with such hope that Ethan felt physically ill. He'd explained about heaven, about their parents watching over them, but Rebecca was too young to understand the permanence of death. How could he make her understand something he himself was struggling to accept? "She can't come back, Becca," he said gently. "Remember what I told you. She's in heaven now with your pa." "But I need her," Rebecca wailed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know," Ethan said, gathering her into his arms, her small body stiff against his chest. "I know you do." As he held his sobbing niece, Ethan faced the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He was failing these children. They needed more than he could give. They needed a mother's touch, a woman's guidance, but there was no solution to that problem. He couldn't conjure up a wife, and even if he could, what woman would want to take on a struggling rancher and 3 grieving children? The next morning, a Saturday in early October, dawned crisp and clear. Ethan had been up since 4, repairing a broken fence in the north pasture before returning to make breakfast. He was scraping burned oatmeal from a pot when a knock sounded at the front door. Wiping his hands on his jeans, he opened the door to find a woman standing on his porch, a basket covered with a checkered cloth in her arms and a hesitant smile on her face. "Mr. Nash?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. Ethan stared, momentarily speechless. She was tall for a woman, with warm brown eyes and honey blonde hair peeking out from beneath her bonnet. Her dress was simple but well-made, a practical blue calico that suggested a woman of modest means but good taste. "Yes, madam," he finally managed. "I'm Zoe Harrington," she said. "The new school teacher. I've just arrived in Willow Creek, and Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house mentioned your situation." She lifted the basket slightly. "I've brought some bread, fresh baked this morning, and I thought perhaps I might be of some assistance with the children." The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the basket, making Ethan's mouth water. He couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted homemade bread. "That's very kind of you, Miss Harrington, but we're managing fine," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Zoe's eyes, observant and intelligent, took in his disheveled appearance, the dark circles under his eyes and the chaos visible behind him. One eyebrow raised slightly. "Of course," she said diplomatically, "but I'll leave the bread all the same. The children might enjoy it." As if summoned by the mention of them, all 3 appeared in the hallway behind Ethan. Abigail pushed forward, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Are you a friend of Uncle Ethan's?" she asked. Zoe's smile deepened, revealing a dimple in her left cheek. "Not yet," she said, kneeling down to Abigail's level. "But I hope to be. I'm Miss Harrington, the new teacher at Willow Creek School." "I'm going to school next year," Thomas announced, stepping forward. "Pa said so." A shadow crossed his face as he remembered that his father wouldn't be there to see it, and Ethan felt the now familiar ache of helplessness. "Well, I shall look forward to having you in my class," Zoe said warmly. She looked past the children into the house, her expression revealing nothing of what she thought of the disarray. "Mr. Nash, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a cup of coffee. The ride from town was rather chilly." Ethan hesitated. The house was a disaster, and he didn't want this neat, composed woman seeing the evidence of his failure. But the children were already tugging at her hands, eager for new company, and he found himself stepping back to allow her entry. "I apologize for the state of things," he muttered as she followed him to the kitchen. "We've been adjusting. No need for apologies," Zoe said, placing her basket on the table and removing the cloth to reveal 2 loaves of golden brown bread. Losing loved ones leaves little energy for housekeeping. She moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, locating coffee and the pot without having to ask, building up the fire in the stove that had died down to embers. Ethan watched, feeling both relieved and uncomfortable as she took control of his kitchen. "Miss Harrington," he began, unsure of what he wanted to say. "Please call me Zoe," she said, turning to face him. "I hope you don't mind my intrusion, Mr. Nash. But Mrs. Patterson mentioned that you might be in need of some assistance, and as I'm new in town and eager to meet my future students, it seemed a natural visit to make." Before Ethan could respond, Rebecca tugged at Zoe's skirt. "Can I have some bread?" she asked, eyeing the loaves hungrily. "Of course," Zoe said, producing a knife from somewhere and cutting 3 thick slices. She spread them with butter from the crock on the table and handed them to the children, who accepted them eagerly. "This is so good," Abigail said, her eyes wide. "It tastes like Mama's." Ethan tensed, waiting for the tears that usually followed any mention of Mary, but Zoe handled the moment with grace. "Your mama must have been an excellent baker," she said gently. "Perhaps one day you can tell me about her special recipes." Abigail nodded, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. As the coffee brewed, Zoe moved around the kitchen, quietly setting things in order. She washed the breakfast dishes, wiped down the table, and swept the floor, all while engaging the children in conversation, drawing them out in a way Ethan hadn't been able to do. "Mr. Nash," she said as she poured the coffee, "I find myself with free time on the weekends, as the school term hasn't yet begun. I would be happy to assist you and the children with whatever you might need." Ethan's pride warred with practicality. The children clearly responded to her, and God knew they needed a woman's influence, but accepting help felt like admitting defeat. "That's a generous offer, Miss Zoe," he said, "but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," she said firmly. "It would be my pleasure." And she added with a hint of humor, "It would give me something to do besides listen to Mrs. Patterson's endless tales of her rheumatism." Despite himself, Ethan smiled. "Well, when you put it that way." "Excellent," Zoe said, clapping her hands together. "Then it's settled. I'll come tomorrow after church, if that suits you." Ethan nodded, realizing too late that he'd just agreed to attend church, something he hadn't done since the funeral. But as he watched Zoe help Rebecca wash sticky bread crumbs from her fingers, he found he didn't mind the prospect of seeing her again. After Zoe left, promising to return the next day, the house felt strangely empty despite the presence of the 3 children. "I like Miss Harrington," Abigail declared as they ate slices of Zoe's bread for lunch. "She doesn't treat me like a baby." "She smells nice," Thomas added. "Like cookies." Even Rebecca, who had been the most withdrawn since her parents' death, seemed brighter. "She said she would teach me a song tomorrow," she informed Ethan importantly. "Did she now?" Ethan said, watching his nieces and nephew with a mixture of relief and unease. One visit from Zoe Harrington had accomplished more than weeks of his fumbling efforts. True to her word, Zoe appeared after church the next day, this time with a basket containing a chicken pie and fresh apples. She wore a different dress, a warm russet color that brought out the gold in her hair, and Ethan found himself noticing details about her that he hadn't the day before: the graceful way she moved, the musical quality of her laugh, the intelligent spark in her eyes. Over the next few weeks, Zoe became a regular fixture at the Nash ranch. She arrived every Saturday and Sunday, sometimes with food, always with a smile and seemingly endless patience. Under her guidance, the house gradually transformed. Curtains were washed, floors were scrubbed, and meals became regular affairs with balanced nutrition. More importantly, the children began to heal. Abigail emerged from her shell of premature responsibility, allowing herself to be a child again. Thomas stopped having nightmares and began helping Ethan with simple ranch chores, proud to be treated like one of the men. And Rebecca, who had cried for her mother every night, now went to bed peacefully after Zoe read her a story. Ethan watched these changes with a mixture of gratitude and growing affection for the woman who had brought them about. Zoe never mentioned payment for her help, brushing aside his awkward attempts to compensate her. "Seeing the children happy is payment enough," she told him one Sunday afternoon as they sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard. Still, you're giving up your free time, Ethan insisted. There must be something I can do to thank you. Zoe considered for a moment, then smiled. Well, there is one thing. The school board is organizing a harvest festival to raise money for new books. Would you and the children attend? It would mean a great deal to me. Of course, Ethan agreed, relieved that her request was so simple. We'd be happy to. The harvest festival was held in the town square on the last Saturday of October. Ethan had spent extra time that morning ensuring the children were clean and presentably dressed, even managing to tame Rebecca's unruly curls into neat braids with ribbons Zoe had brought her. The festival was in full swing when they arrived, with booths selling handicrafts, games for the children, and tables laden with food for the communal supper. Ethan felt a momentary panic at the crowd, but then Zoe was there, resplendent in a green dress that matched her eyes, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "You came," she exclaimed, taking Rebecca's hand. "And don't you all look wonderful?" The afternoon passed pleasantly as Zoe introduced them to people from town, many of whom Ethan knew only in passing. He was surprised to find himself enjoying the social interaction, especially when he noticed the respect with which people treated Zoe. She was clearly well-liked and admired, despite being relatively new to Willow Creek. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the square, and musicians set up for dancing. Ethan watched as couples took to the makeshift dance floor, feeling a strange longing he hadn't experienced in years. "Penny for your thoughts," Zoe said, appearing at his side with 2 cups of cider. "Just thinking that it's been a long time since I've been to something like this," Ethan admitted, accepting the cider gratefully. "The children seem to be enjoying themselves," Zoe observed, nodding toward where Abigail and Thomas were playing a ring-toss game under the watchful eye of Mrs. Patterson. Rebecca had fallen asleep on a blanket nearby, clutching the rag doll Zoe had made her. "Thanks to you," Ethan said. "They're different children than they were a month ago." Zoe's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "They're remarkable children, resilient and loving. You're doing a fine job with them, Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and Ethan found he liked the sound of it on her lips. "Would you care to dance?" he asked impulsively as the band struck up a waltz. Zoe looked surprised but pleased. "I'd be delighted." He led her to the dance floor, suddenly nervous. It had been years since he'd danced, not since before the war, but his body remembered the steps. Zoe fit perfectly in his arms, her hand small but strong in his, her waist slender beneath his other hand. "You dance very well," she commented as they moved among the other couples. "My mother insisted both her sons learn," Ethan said. "Said no son of hers would embarrass a lady on a dance floor." "A wise woman," Zoe said with a smile. "I'm sorry I never met her." "She would have liked you," Ethan said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. His mother, who had died 5 years earlier, would have approved of Zoe's practicality, her kindness, and her devotion to the children. They danced in companionable silence, and Ethan found himself studying her face in the soft lantern light. She wasn't classically beautiful, but there was something compelling about her features: the intelligence in her eyes, the determination in her chin, the warmth of her smile. She caught him looking and held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was broken by Thomas, who ran up to tug at Ethan's sleeve. "Uncle Ethan, Mr. Johnson says he'll give me a ride on his pony if it's all right with you," he said excitedly. Ethan reluctantly released Zoe. "That's very kind of Mr. Johnson. You mind your manners and thank him properly." As Thomas raced off, Zoe chuckled. "He's becoming quite the young gentleman." "He's trying to be like his father," Ethan said, a familiar pang of grief striking him. "James was always good with people." Zoe's expression softened. "Tell me about him," she said. "About James and Mary. The children mention them sometimes, but I'd like to hear your perspective." No one had asked Ethan about his brother and sister-in-law before, at least not in a way that invited real conversation rather than platitudes. As they moved away from the dance floor to sit on a bench at the edge of the square, he found himself talking freely about James, his brother's quick laugh, his talent with horses, his unwavering optimism even in the face of drought and hardship. "Mary balanced him," Ethan said, smiling at the memory of his sister-in-law. She was practical where James was a dreamer, cautious where he was impulsive, but they adored each other and they were wonderful parents. The children reflect that love, Zoe said. They've inherited the best of both of them. I just hope I don't let them down, Ethan admitted, voicing his deepest fear. James trusted me to raise them if anything happened, but I don't know if I'm doing right by them. You are, Zoe said firmly, placing her hand on his arm. You stepped up when they needed you most. You're providing for them, protecting them, and loving them. That's what matters. Her confidence in him was like a balm to his soul, and Ethan found himself wanting to be the man she seemed to think he was. The evening ended with Rebecca asleep in Ethan's arms and the other children drowsy, but happy as they rode home in the wagon. Zoe had declined his offer of a ride, explaining that she'd promised to help clean up after the festival. I'll see you tomorrow, though. Ethan asked, surprising himself with how much he hoped the answer would be yes. Of course, Zoe assured him with a smile that lingered in his mind long after he'd put the children to bed. As November arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hint of winter, Ethan found himself counting the days between Zoe's visits. She was busier now that school had started, often grading papers or preparing lessons while at the ranch, but she never missed a weekend. The children adored her. Abigail and Thomas were flourishing in school under her tutelage, and Rebecca begged daily to be allowed to attend Miss Zoe's school despite being too young. Maybe next year, little one, Zoe would say, but she made sure to include Rebecca in simple lessons at home, teaching her letters and numbers alongside songs and stories. Ethan watched their growing attachment with a mixture of joy and trepidation. What would happen if Zoe decided to move on, as teachers often did in small towns like Willow Creek? The children had already lost so much. Losing Zoe would be another devastating blow, and what about his own feelings? Ethan had to admit, if only to himself, that his interest in Zoe had grown beyond gratitude. He found himself noticing little things about her, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, the sound of her humming as she worked in the kitchen, the gentle but firm way she redirected the children when they misbehaved. One Saturday in mid-November, Zoe arrived looking pale and tired, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant presence. "Are you unwell?" Ethan asked as he helped her down from her rented buggy. "Just a slight headache," she assured him, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that Zoe was more than slightly unwell. Her cheeks were flushed, and she swayed on her feet as she attempted to help Rebecca with a simple sewing project. "That's it," Ethan said, taking the sewing from her hands. "You're sick and you're going to rest." For once, Zoe didn't argue. She allowed him to lead her to the sofa in the parlor, where she sank down gratefully. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't want to disappoint the children by not coming." "The children would be more disappointed if you made yourself seriously ill," Ethan told her, placing a hand on her forehead. It was burning hot. "You've got a fever." Concern tightened his chest. Fever had taken James and Mary, and while he knew intellectually that not all fevers were typhoid, he couldn't help the fear that gripped him. "I'll be fine," Zoe insisted, but her eyes were glassy and her voice weak. "You're not going back to town like this," Ethan decided. "You'll stay here tonight, and we'll see how you are in the morning." He expected her to protest, but she merely nodded, a sign of how truly ill she felt. Ethan sent Thomas to fetch water and asked Abigail to find a clean nightgown of Mary's that might fit Zoe. Then he carried her to the spare bedroom, trying not to think about how right she felt in his arms or how his heart raced at the feel of her head resting against his shoulder. For the next 2 days, Zoe battled a high fever. Ethan sat by her bedside, applying cool cloths to her forehead and helping her sip broth when she was lucid enough to swallow. The children tiptoed around the house, their faces solemn with worry. "Is Miss Zoe going to die like Mama and Papa?" Thomas asked on the second night, his small face pinched with fear. "No," Ethan said firmly, praying he was right. "Miss Zoe has a strong constitution, and it's just a winter fever, not typhoid." He had the doctor out from town, who confirmed this diagnosis and left medicine that seemed to help. By the third day, Zoe's fever broke, and she woke clear-eyed and weak but definitely on the mend. You took care of me, she said wonderingly as Ethan brought her tea. Seems only fair, considering how much you've done for us, he replied, sitting on the edge of her bed. You had us worried, though. I'm sorry, she said, reaching out to touch his hand. I didn't mean to be a burden. You could never be a burden, Zoe, Ethan said seriously. You're important to me. Her eyes widened slightly at his words, a flush that had nothing to do with fever coloring her cheeks. Thank you for saying that, she said softly. You and the children have become very important to me as well. There was more he wanted to say, but the moment was interrupted by Rebecca bursting into the room, closely followed by her siblings. Miss Zoe, you're awake, she exclaimed, climbing onto the bed and throwing her arms around Zoe's neck. Careful, Becca, Ethan cautioned. Miss Zoe is still recovering. It's all right, Zoe said, hugging Rebecca back. This is the best medicine I could ask for. Zoe stayed at the ranch for another 3 days, recovering her strength. During that time, Ethan saw a different side of her, not the capable, composed schoolteacher, but a woman with vulnerabilities and needs of her own. He learned that she was an orphan, raised by an aunt in St. Louis, who had come west seeking independence and adventure. Teaching seemed the most respectable profession for a woman alone, she explained as they sat by the fire one evening after the children were in bed. And I genuinely love children. You're a natural with them, Ethan said. They adore you. The feeling is mutual, Zoe said, her expression softening. They're remarkable children, Ethan. You should be proud of how well they're adjusting. That's largely thanks to you, he admitted. I was floundering before you came along. Zoe shook her head. You were doing the best you could in an impossible situation. Don't sell yourself short. Her faith in him warmed something inside Ethan that had been cold for too long. As he walked her to her room that night, he found himself lingering outside her door, reluctant to say goodnight. I suppose I should return to town tomorrow, Zoe said, sounding equally reluctant. School starts again on Monday. Of course, Ethan said. I'll drive you. Thank you, she said, then hesitated before adding, I've enjoyed being here despite the circumstances. We've enjoyed having you, Ethan replied. The house feels more like a home when you're in it. Zoe's eyes filled with something that looked like longing. Good night, Ethan, she said softly, and then, before he could respond, she stood on tiptoe and brushed a gentle kiss against his cheek. The spot where her lips had touched him burned pleasantly as he made his way to his own room, his mind filled with thoughts of what it might be like to have Zoe in his house permanently, to fall asleep and wake up with her beside him, to build a life together with the children. The next morning, he drove her back to town, the children insisting on coming along to see Miss Zoe's house, which turned out to be a small room at the back of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. It's not much, Zoe said apologetically as they crowded into the neat but tiny space. But it serves my needs. Ethan looked around at the sparse furnishings: a narrow bed, a small desk covered with schoolbooks, a battered trunk that presumably held her clothes. There were a few personal touches: a quilt that she mentioned her aunt had made, a shelf of books, a vase of dried wildflowers. But the room felt temporary, as if Zoe hadn't fully settled in Willow Creek. How long do you plan to stay in town? He asked as they walked back to the wagon. Zoe looked surprised by the question. I signed a contract for the school year, she said. After that, I haven't decided. The thought of her leaving in the spring made Ethan's chest tighten uncomfortably. The children would miss you, he said, unable to admit that he would miss her even more. I would miss them too, Zoe said, her eyes meeting his. And you. There was something in her gaze that gave Ethan hope, but before he could respond, Mrs. Patterson appeared on the porch, calling Zoe's name. I should go, Zoe said regretfully. The children have school tomorrow, and I have lessons to prepare. We'll see you next weekend, Ethan asked. Of course, Zoe promised, and the smile she gave him carried him through the long week ahead. As November gave way to December, the ranch was transformed under Zoe's influence. Christmas preparations began in earnest. Paper chains and popcorn strings decorated the parlor, and the smell of gingerbread filled the kitchen. The children buzzed with excitement, their grief temporarily overshadowed by the holiday spirit. Ethan found himself caught up in their enthusiasm, cutting down a pine tree from the north ridge, and setting it up in the parlor. Zoe taught them to make ornaments from pine cones and ribbons, and Abigail proudly placed a star made of twisted wire at the top. "It's the prettiest tree we've ever had," she declared, and no one mentioned that it was the first Christmas without their parents. The Saturday before Christmas, Ethan drove into town alone, leaving the children in Zoe's care. He had gifts to buy, small tokens for the children, and something special for Zoe. He'd been saving for weeks, setting aside a portion of the money from the sale of 2 calves. In the general store, he selected candy and small toys for the children, then lingered over the display of ladies' accessories. A silver hairpin caught his eye, elegant but not ostentatious, with a small pearl nestled among delicate filigree. "That's a fine piece," the shopkeeper commented. "For someone special." "Yes," Ethan said, making his decision. "I'll take it." The price made him wince, but as the shopkeeper wrapped the hairpin in tissue paper, Ethan knew it was worth it. He wanted Zoe to have something beautiful, something that would let her know how much she had come to mean to him and the children. When he returned to the ranch, he found Zoe and the children in the kitchen making Christmas cookies. Flour dusted Zoe's cheeks and Rebecca had icing in her hair, but they were all laughing, the sound filling the house with a joy that had been absent for too long. "Uncle Ethan," Thomas exclaimed, "Miss Zoe is teaching us to make cookies shaped like stars." "I can see that," Ethan said, smiling at the scene before him. "Looks like you're having quite a time." "We saved some dough for you," Zoe said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought you might want to try your hand at cookie cutting." For the next hour, Ethan joined in the fun, marveling at how natural it felt to be in the kitchen with Zoe and the children, creating memories that he hoped would help ease the pain of the first Christmas without James and Mary. Later, after the children were in bed, Ethan and Zoe sat by the fire, drinking hot cider and discussing plans for Christmas Day. "I've been invited to dine with the Reverend and his wife," Zoe mentioned, "but I'd much rather spend the day here if that's all right with you." "More than all right," Ethan assured her. "The children would be heartbroken if you weren't here on Christmas morning." "Only the children?" Zoe asked softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Ethan took a deep breath. "No," he admitted. "I would miss you too, very much." Zoe's cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "Then I'll be here," she promised. They sat in companionable silence for a while, and Ethan found himself studying her profile, the delicate curve of her neck, the way her hair caught the firelight. He wanted to tell her how he felt, but the words seemed inadequate. "Zoe," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She turned to look at him, her expression open and expectant. "Yes, I want to thank you," he said, cursing his cowardice, "for everything you've done for us." "For the children." "You don't need to thank me," Zoe said, a hint of disappointment in her voice. "I care about you all very much." Ethan knew he was missing an opportunity, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. Zoe's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings growing between them. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with a dusting of rare Texas snow that set the children squealing with delight. Zoe arrived early, her arms laden with small gifts and a basket of fresh bread for breakfast. The day was everything Ethan had hoped for, filled with laughter, good food, and the warmth of being with people he cared about. The children were thrilled with their gifts, and Ethan felt a surge of pride when Abigail declared it the best Christmas ever. After dinner, while the children played with their new toys, Ethan found a moment alone with Zoe in the kitchen. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly nervous as he handed her the small package. Zoe unwrapped it carefully, her breath catching as she revealed the silver hairpin. "Ethan," she whispered, "it's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," he said, the words coming more easily than he'd expected. "I wanted you to have something special, something that shows how much you mean to us." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received," she said. Would you help me put it in?" Ethan took the hairpin from her trembling fingers. With more gentleness than he knew he possessed, he gathered a strand of her honey gold hair and secured it with the pin, his fingertips brushing against her temple. "Perfect," he murmured, his hand lingering on her cheek. Zoe leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Ethan," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." His heart raced. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position at a school in Denver," she said, the words tumbling out quickly. "The salary is better, and the school is newer with more resources." Ethan felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "You're leaving," he said, his voice hollow. "I haven't decided yet," Zoe said, placing her hand over his where it still rested on her cheek. "I have until the end of January to give my answer. When would you go?" Ethan asked, trying to process this unexpected news. "Not until June, after the school year ends," Zoe said. "But Ethan, I need to know. Would I be leaving anything behind worth staying for?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, but it also gave him the opening he needed. "Yes," he said firmly. "The children need you, I need you." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Zoe. I think I have been since the day you walked up to the house with that basket of bread and that smile that lit up my world." Zoe's eyes widened, and for a moment Ethan feared he'd said too much, too soon. But then she was in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "I've been falling in love with you too," she confessed. "With you and with the children. The thought of leaving breaks my heart, but I didn't know if you felt the same way." "I do," Ethan assured her, his hands gentle on her waist. "I do feel the same way." Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that was sweet and tender and full of promise. "Uncle Ethan's kissing Miss Zoe." Thomas's voice broke the moment, and they turned to find all three children standing in the doorway, watching with varying expressions of surprise and delight. "Does this mean Miss Zoe's going to be our new mama?" Abigail asked, her eyes wide with hope. Ethan looked at Zoe, his heart in his eyes. "That depends on Miss Zoe," he said, "but I certainly hope so." Zoe's smile was radiant. "Nothing would make me happier," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If you'll have me." "Yes," Rebecca shouted, rushing forward to wrap her arms around Zoe's legs. Thomas and Abigail quickly followed, and soon they were all laughing and crying at once, a tangle of arms and hopes and dreams for the future. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep, exhausted from the excitement of the day, Ethan and Zoe sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt against the winter chill. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, still hardly able to believe his good fortune. "Marrying a widowed rancher with 3 children isn't exactly a romantic dream come true." "It's exactly my dream come true," Zoe corrected him, nestling closer against his side. "I've never wanted a conventional life, Ethan. I've always wanted a family to love, children to nurture, and a partner to share it all with. You and the children are everything I've ever wanted." "What about Denver?" he asked, the offer still weighing on his mind. "Denver can find another teacher," Zoe said firmly. "My place is here with you and the children." She paused, then added more tentatively, "That is, if you're certain you want to marry me. We haven't known each other very long," and Ethan silenced her with a kiss, pouring all his feelings into it. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said when they finally broke apart. "I love you, Zoe Harrington. Will you marry me and be a mother to these children?" "Yes," Zoe said simply. "With all my heart, yes." They were married in the small church in Willow Creek on a bright Saturday in February. Abigail was the flower girl, Thomas proudly carried the rings, and Rebecca walked down the aisle just ahead of Zoe, scattering rose petals with more enthusiasm than precision. Zoe wore a simple gown of ivory silk, Mary's pearl earrings, a gift from Abigail who had inherited them, and the silver hairpin Ethan had given her for Christmas. As she walked toward him, Ethan thought she had never looked more beautiful. The Reverend spoke of love and family, of building a life together through good times and bad. Ethan and Zoe exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to love and cherish not only each other, but the 3 children who were now officially becoming their family. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed his bride to the cheers of the entire town, who had turned out to witness the union of their schoolteacher and the rancher who had been raising his brother's children alone. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the town hall, with food contributed by every family in Willow Creek and dancing that lasted well into the night. Ethan and Zoe had their first dance as husband and wife to the same waltz they had danced to at the Harvest Festival, the moment when they had both begun to acknowledge their feelings for each other. "Happy?" Ethan asked as he held her close. "Completely," Zoe assured him, her eyes shining with love. "This is just the beginning of our story, Ethan Nash." "The best beginning I could have imagined," he agreed, thinking of how far they had come from that first day when she had appeared on his porch with warm bread and a smile that had begun to heal his broken family. As the seasons changed, the Nash Ranch flourished under the care of its expanded family. Zoe continued teaching at the school, driving into town each morning and returning home each afternoon to help with ranch chores and spend time with the children. Ethan found that with Zoe by his side, the work seemed less daunting, the future brighter. They faced challenges, of course. The spring brought heavy rains that flooded part of the lower pasture, and summer saw a drought that threatened the crops. But they weathered these storms together, their love and commitment to each other, and the children never wavering. The children thrived under Zoe's gentle guidance. Abigail, now 8, showed a talent for music that Zoe encouraged, teaching her to play the small piano in the parlor that had been silent since Mary's death. Thomas, 6 and full of energy, became Ethan's shadow on the ranch, learning the skills he would need to one day take over the family business. And Rebecca, 4 and utterly devoted to her new mother, blossomed into a confident, cheerful child who no longer cried for what she had lost, but instead embraced the new family that had formed around her. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zoe took Ethan's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I have some news," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "We're going to have a baby." Ethan's heart swelled with joy as he gathered her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Zoe asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Ethan assured her, placing a gentle kiss on her lips. "How do you think the children will take the news?" "They'll be thrilled," Zoe said confidently. "Abigail has been hinting about wanting a baby sister for months now, and if it's a boy," Ethan teased, "then Thomas will have a partner in mischief," Zoe laughed. "And either way, Rebecca will have someone to mother." They told the children the next morning over breakfast, and as Zoe had predicted, the news was met with excitement and a flood of questions. "Where will the baby sleep?" Abigail wanted to know. "Can I teach him to ride?" Thomas asked. "When will it get here?" Rebecca demanded, impatient as always. Ethan and Zoe answered their questions as best they could, marveling at the easy acceptance with which the children welcomed the idea of a new sibling. As Zoe's pregnancy progressed, the entire family became involved in preparations for the new arrival. Ethan expanded the nursery adjacent to their bedroom. Thomas helped him paint the walls a cheerful yellow, and Abigail and Rebecca assisted Zoe in making tiny clothes and a patchwork quilt for the cradle that had once held all 3 Nash children. In the evenings, they would often sit together in the parlor, Zoe's sewing in her lap, the children playing or reading, and Ethan watching them all with a contentment he had never expected to feel again after James and Mary's deaths. "Sometimes I can't believe how lucky we are," he told Zoe one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. "After James and Mary died, I thought the best I could hope for was to keep the children safe and the ranch running. I never imagined I could be this happy again. It's not luck," Zoe said, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "It's love and hard work and being open to possibilities even when they arrive in unexpected ways. Like a schoolteacher with a basket of bread," Ethan teased. "Exactly like that," Zoe agreed, snuggling closer. "Sometimes the best blessings come in the simplest packages." In February, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Zoe gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James Ethan Nash, honoring the uncle he would never know and the father who would raise him with all the love and wisdom he possessed. The older children were enchanted with their new brother. Abigail appointed herself his special guardian, Moas delighted in making the baby smile, and Rebecca took her role as big sister very seriously, insisting on helping with every aspect of the baby's care that she could manage. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the land, Ethan stood on the porch one evening, watching Zoe in the garden with baby James in a sling across her chest, and the older children helping her plant flowers around the house that had once seemed so empty and silent. The sound of their laughter carried on the breeze, a melody that filled his heart to overflowing. From grief and loss had come this unexpected joy, this family cobbled together by love and circumstances and the courage to begin again. Zoe looked up, catching his eye, and smiled the same warm, bright smile that had first lit up his world on that autumn day when she'd appeared on his doorstep. She beckoned him to join them, and as he crossed the yard to embrace his family, Ethan Nash knew that he had found his true home. Not in the land that had been in his family for generations, not in the house built by his father's hands, but in the love of a woman who had seen his struggles and offered not pity but partnership, and in the children his brothers, and now his own, who filled each day with purpose and meaning. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Zoe asked as he reached them, slipping an arm around her waist and dropping a kiss on their son's downy head. "Just counting my blessings," Ethan replied, watching as Abigail showed Rebecca how to pat the soil gently around a tiny plant. "And thinking that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected ways." Zoe's eyes softened with understanding. "Like warm bread and a smile," she suggested, the phrase that had become a shorthand between them for the day that had changed both their lives. "Exactly like that," Ethan agreed, pulling her closer. "Exactly like that." And as the Texas sun set on the Nash ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the family that had been forged in grief and hardship, but tempered by love, continued planting seeds for a future rich with promise and possibility, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, with enough care and tenderness, new life can flourish.